Good afternoon. This is Tim Hamilton from Grace Medical. Miss Ashley has asked me to present to you some information on scope of practice within the field of aesthetics. I'm going to delve into some more advanced treatments that are available in this industry under medical oversight. And I'm going to talk about some class 2 devices as well as some class 1 devices so you can become more educated about light tissue interaction. This is going to be a 3-part presentation, and one of the parts that I'm going to start with is laser physics. I'm going to overview how light tissue interacts, the different modalities. Some of you may be doing these treatments already in the form of LED treatments. I'm going to share with you some of the newer technology that's out there. One I just got in a few days ago that I'll show you how that works and explain some of the physics and the tissue interaction with that. And that'll be the first portion, how laser hair removal works, how light and tissue interact in a process that we call selective photothermolysis. Then I'm going to go into part 2, which will cover a brief overview of chemical peels. And the chemical peels we're going to talk about conceptually without any specific product types, but we'll talk about how they work. The big fear in chemical peels is, do they make you peel? Or what are we using? So we'll address some of that. At the end, we will go live. So these first 2 sections will be pre-recorded, and the last section will be presented to you in a class that I'm teaching while you're watching this. And I'll show you some of the people who are studying to do some of these treatments in an advanced training modality. So we'll start off with an introduction into laser physics and how light and tissue interact. So I'm going to start by doing a screen share. On how lasers and IPLs and LEDs work. So before we get too far into this, one of the things we need to understand about the data and the treatments that are offered in the medical industry, which is where I'm going to start with, and then we'll segue into the aesthetics industry and how that works. You need to be aware of this because there are lots of opinions in our industry, and the opinions that you have may not or may coincide with the statistical data that is collected. There's a group of physicians across the country that analyze and publish data of treatments and procedures that they do. And for many years, they've been collecting both surgical and non-surgical procedures on the number of procedures they've done and the income they generate. And it's published every year, the following the year after they collect the data. So they collect it from all of their participating physicians, they analyze it, and they then publish it the following year on what is the most popular. And these have been in the medical industry in the top 10 over the past decade or more. We see that these treatments are popular, more than popular. They're increasing in their popularity. So my point in saying that is there's a lot of people across the country who are saying that some procedures are not as popular or we don't offer them as much. What you need to analyze is why aren't you offering them if you're able to, key point there. Is it because you don't know enough about it, you're not properly trained, you don't have the equipment, or you don't have the medical oversight? You can look at any one of those and then go back to the data and say, this is what people are doing. This is what they're asking for. This is what they're receiving. So chemical peels and microdermabrasion treatments are within the scope of your practice. Many doctors' offices offer them. You can offer very, very similar treatments to what they're doing in the doctor's office under those categories of chemical peels and microdermabrasion. Microdermabrasion is a class 1 exempt device. It is very popular. There's many different modalities. There's crystal, there's diamond tip, what we call crystal free, and there's the new generation of liquid microdermabrasions, of which there are quite a variety of those on the marketplace as well. They all exfoliate the stratum corneum, and they're done in a repetitive manner every 7 to 14 days through a series of treatments. Chemical peels do the same type of thing. They exfoliate the stratum corneum. They're done in a repetitive manner every 7 to 14 days. Many people think you do one of these and maybe a month later you do another. Part of that depends upon what's the pH and what's the concentration. We'll come back to that in part 2 of this presentation after a break. So we'll start with the category of permanent hair removal, and we'll lump that into a category that we're going to call photofacial. And this is a kind of a difficult heading to give this because the word photofacial implies you're putting light on the face. Unfortunately, you can do that in a way that heals the tissue. That's one way of doing it. And we use that in an LED modality, light emitting diode. And that heals the tissue using specific colors of light, which we call wavelengths. And I'll go into that laser physics in just a moment. Another way we can put light on the face is a device that has been labeled IPL, which stands for intense pulsed light. That causes tissue destruction. And there's yet another category of light on the face that's also called photofacial that we call laser. Okay? And laser destroys tissue as well. Finds a target, and that target absorbs the color or wavelength of light. And enough heat is generated from that absorption of light, transforming it into heat, which destroys the tissue, which we call cell lysis or cell destruction. LEDs are across the board universally accepted. We use LEDs in everyday life. We use them in our television screens. We use them in our household lighting. We use them for car headlights. We use them in any number of manner. And they've been really remarkable in our lifespan of the conversion of light into a digital display of light. So when we look at LEDs and what category they are, can we use them in the scope of our practice? The answer is absolutely we can. And if you're not doing it, you should look into it because they really are remarkable in what they do. We use them in my training classes all the time after almost every procedure because they heal the tissue with the science behind how the light changes the tissue in a healing manner and a reproductive manner. It makes cell division increase significantly, and we'll present some of the scientific data that supports that. So as we look into the science behind how does this work, we have to also look into, can we use this in the scope of our practice? And in aesthetics, you're limited by the South Carolina Board of Cosmetology to using Class 1 devices, of which LEDs fall into. So how does this work? Well, LEDs use different colors of light to make the cells do what they do better. So they enhance the production of the cells. And when they do this by using the correct wavelength of light, which I'll go into in just a moment. So we'll get into just a little bit, just a wee bit of laser physics so you can understand how that works. Because it's a pretty specific science. It's down to a billionth of a meter in how we measure different colors of light. Very, very exact. So when we use the right color or wavelength of light in an LED format, light emitting diode, it causes the cells to be stimulated and actually divide faster. LEDs are primarily in what we call a Class 1 category. And if you look at the definition of Class 1 versus Class 2, Class 1 devices are overseen by your licensing board. In the case of aesthetics and cosmetology in the state of South Carolina, that's the Board of Cosmetology, and they allow you to do Class 1 devices. The other category of FDA devices that are on the marketplace are what are called Class 2, and that means that medical oversight is required. And in the state of South Carolina, that medical oversight requires the physician to be on the premises when the device is being used. So class 2 devices, which are run through the FDA, are dependent upon what the manufacturer submits to the FDA and what the FDA approves. So class 2 devices are what we call prescription devices. They include lasers and IPLs, and the way that the Board of Medicine defines them in South Carolina is they call them surgical devices, which can alter the tissue and therefore require physician oversight. Class 1 devices, like LEDs, do not. Anyone can use them. You can buy these just about anywhere and everywhere. LEDs are rather unique because they provide no sensory information. So when you put LEDs on the skin, you feel nothing. So LEDs create light without using a lot of power consumption. So they require very little energy to use. You feel nothing. They're what we call athermal. And when you put the letter A in front of a word in science, it means none. So they're athermal devices that when you apply them on or near the tissue, you don't feel anything. And what they do is they create change according to the color of light, which is measured in wavelengths. And those wavelengths, I'm going to go through the physics behind that in just a moment. So how long is the wavelength? And the other measurement device that we use is how powerful or how strong is the device. And that's measured in a unit of energy that's called joules, which is spelled Joules. So what the wavelength and what the energy output are going to completely depend upon what the tissue reaction is going to be. What we find in LED is it helps to calm the tissue down. So any redness or erythema you get during any of the treatments that you offer, the use of an LED post-treatment creates no tissue sensation from a sensory standpoint. The clients don't feel it, but yet it makes the wounds heal significantly faster. It makes mitosis occur 100 times faster, and it takes the inflammatory response down so that the redness goes away. And that happens, according to the clinical data, after only submitting the tissue to the LED wavelengths for 1.5 minutes. So you can get tissue reaction in just 90 seconds. But you can also put the LED lights on the tissue for much longer than that. We usually use about 10 to 15 minutes following a procedure, but I've been under these LED lights for 2 hours, and there's not an over treatment risk with LEDs because they're continuing to heal the tissue and they're not causing tissue damage as opposed to IPLs and lasers. So the science behind this industry is pretty solid. The aerospace industry, when they're not caught up in getting a Mars rover onto the planet's surface, or when they're not working with the International Space Station, they do an amazing job of research and development. NASA has developed so many things. And one of the things they came up with, which was published 20 years ago in a Journal of Clinical Laser Medicine and Surgery, was they used LEDs, and irradiate means to shine. So they shine this tissue onto they shine the light onto the tissue, and they found that damaged fibroblasts in these petri dishes increased their recovery time by literally growing and dividing 100 times faster. So they documented this at very, very specific colors of light, which we call wavelengths. So this healing occurs by using specific wavelengths on the tissue. Now let's talk about how wavelengths work. And wavelengths are what we measure electromagnetic energy with. So let's look at what is electromagnetic energies. There are many forms of electromagnetic energy. Let's start on this graph that we see in front. And this graph shows us AM radio, FM radio, television, radar, microwave is right in here. Below that is infrared. Below infrared is electromagnetic energy that we can see. Right in that little tiny gap right here is where we see electromagnetic energy that is visible, and we call that the visible light spectrum. In this graphic interpretation of electromagnetic energy, that little tiny window right there has been extrapolated at the bottom of this, and all of these colors of light fit in between infrared and ultraviolet. So that electromagnetic energy is what we can see, and we call that the visible light spectrum. And that includes the colors of the rainbow, which are visible. And those colors include red, orange, you know the drill. You learned this in the 5th grade. Red, orange, yellow, green, blue, indigo, and violet. The acronym for that visible light spectrum, remember that, is called Roy G. Biv. So red, orange, yellow, green, blue, indigo, and violet are the colors of electromagnetic energy that we can actually see with the naked eye. Let's go back to the radio. And when we have this energy that is produced or generated as a source, that energy bounces around in the form of a radio wave. That's the key word, wave. That radio signal is generated by a radio station and is broadcast from a radio tower somewhere in your community. And that tower is sending out this sine wave curve through the atmosphere. And it's bouncing around, and we cannot see it. We can't see it, but we know it's there. And how do we know it's there? Well, really simple. We turn on our radio. The signal has bounced from that tower and hit the antenna, which receives the signal. We call that a radio receiver. It receives the energy, it converts it into sound, and it comes out your speakers. That's AM radio. And the way it works is AM radio has a wavelength of 100 meters. So that radio tower is sending out a signal, and that signal bounces around at a wavelength of 100 meters. We can't see it, but right now it's passing through whatever room you're sitting in. That's where that signal is being sent until you eventually turn your radio on and it receives that frequency of that radio station. That's how electromagnetic energy works. It bounces around, and we measure the bounce by how far it is from the top of one wave to the top of another wave. And that measure of that bounce is called a wavelength, and it's measured in the metric system. So AM radio has a wavelength of 100 meters. Why are we going through this? Well, it turns out that when you get down to all of these different sources of electromagnetic energy, and we get down to the only type of electromagnetic energy we can see with the naked eye, that wavelength is so small, we measure it in a billionth of a meter, called a nanometer. And it turns out the devices that we use in the medical cosmetic industry to stop growing hair, to blow up your vascular lesions and pigmented lesions, are in this visible light spectrum, which is measured in the billionth of a meter. So this energy can bounce around the environment, and truly we can only see the visible light spectrum. So when we see a rainbow, it looks very familiar: red, orange, yellow, green, blue, indigo, and violet. And that's produced by the sun. But what we're doing is artificially manufacturing light and electromagnetic energy and measuring the peak of one bounce to the peak of another, and that's called a nanometer, and it's a billionth of a meter. All right, so let's go back to Roy G. Biv just a little bit, and let's finish talking about how these other devices come into play and how we use electromagnetic energy in our industry. So if you look at FM radio, it's got a shorter wavelength, 1 meter, than AM radio, 100 meters. And for those of you who are a little older like me, remember when we used to watch television? And the television station we watched was a choice of either ABC, NBC, CBS, or that public television station that, which as kids, we never really liked to watch. And ironically, as adults, it's what we listen to now. So television used to be broadcast from a television tower somewhere locally, and that TV station would broadcast their electromagnetic energy across the state in what we call a wavelength. And we had this TV antenna on the roof of our house, or if you didn't have a place where you could put it on the roof of your house, you had rabbit ears on the top of your TV, and you would have to position the antenna so that it would properly receive the electromagnetic energy which was being bounced around. Remember those days? We don't even use TV antennas anymore. Instead, we have cable or Wi-Fi or dishes. So TV is a form of electromagnetic energy in the old format of broadcasting electromagnetic energy across the state. You can see that the wavelengths get smaller and smaller until we get down to nanometers. And there's an electromagnetic energy source that's called infrared. I'm going to show you an example of that in just a moment. And that infrared energy has a wavelength of around 1,000 nanometers, and infrared is the wavelength above red. So we've got Roy G. Biv, and above red is infrared. Red, orange, yellow, green, blue, indigo, violet. Below violet is ultraviolet. So all of these are sources of electromagnetic energy. And we measure them in a wavelength that's called nanometers, and that's a billionth of a meter. One of the LEDs that we use can be handheld. Now, when these came out, we actually, one of my colleagues and I manufactured this device probably about 15 years ago. And we'd use this as an add-on to a microdermabrasion system. You can see the microderm crystal system over here. Some of you may still be using that type of device. We made LED lights that plugged into the back of the system, because after you do a microdermabrasion, the effect on some people was a little bit of redness, a little bit of erythema, a little bit of inflammation, and you can take those LEDs and power it off of the energy source of the microdermabrasion. And you can see she's not even touching the skin with it. And you really don't have to touch the skin. It just needs the wavelength. The energy needs to be able to be passed into the epidermal and dermal tissue. And we're going to go through the science behind that in just a moment. It is truly fascinating what this science does to the dermal tissue. I will caution you that if you're still using these, I'm going to caution you by saying this is one of the most boring procedures that I have ever done in skincare, is handheld LEDs. And those of you who are still doing this are going to agree with me and say, yeah, he's right. How do you use this? Well, you work on each section, the midface is a section, for about 10 to 15 minutes. So you could be doing 30 to 45 minutes of just LED. You don't touch the skin with it. What does the client feel? Well, it's athermal. They don't feel anything. These were really fun when they came out because the result was easily visible. You could do a treatment, take 20 to 30 minutes. The client would say, I don't feel anything. Yep, just go ahead and nod off and we'll just keep working. And afterwards, the redness is gone. It's really amazing. And when these first came out, they were extremely difficult to manufacture. We sold these devices for $3,000 for a pair of them. Can you imagine paying $3,000 for a pair of handheld LEDs? We had to charge that much because we had to hand manufacture each one of these on these circuit boards. Very expensive process when we started out. Nowadays, you can put LEDs all over your house for pennies. That's one of the energy savings I did in my house. Is just a few months ago, I exchanged all the light bulbs that Thomas Edison invented over 100 years ago with LED light bulbs, because you can find them so cheap. By the way, Habitat has them for just a couple of dollars for a box of 4 of them. And the LEDs that you buy in new light bulbs, they really don't wear out. It's not like a traditional Thomas Edison invented light bulb with a wire filament that burns out and produces heat. LEDs don't produce heat and they last forever. So just a promotion on, if you want to save some energy and reduce your cost of heating and lighting, LEDs are a great way to do it. So these were a little bit boring, no, a lot boring to use. Then it's the technology to manufacture these devices got more streamlined. Now we see LEDs all over the place. And the panels are really a good way to utilize this LED for what we call photofacial treatments. I like the panels a lot because they're open on either side. One of the issues we get with the wraparound LEDs is the closed-in claustrophobic feeling. You can get the wraparound ones that are either solid or flexible, and I've used those in the past. They work great. They work the same way as this does. I like the rolling aspect of this. I like the fact that you can put this on any body part. So if you're doing body treatments, you can unfold these wings of the LEDs. And I like the fact that it's open on either side, so the client doesn't feel like they're closed in or trapped in there. So, and that's a real feeling if you're claustrophobic. These devices not only are used for increasing cell turnover, they're also used in pain management. One of the issues that happens in pain management is you get inflammation, and that inflammation can cause pain. So one of the aspects of using the right wavelengths is using these LEDs on those inflamed areas, and you reduce the inflammatory response. Again, how long do you put the client under these LED lights for their photofacial treatment? You can get benefits in 90 seconds. Really, what the way you need to put this together in a treatment plan is to figure out how much time before your next client comes in, and that's how much time they can be under the lights. So if you got a 10-minute break between finishing the treatment with this client, you can put them under the lights. You can go do your room cleanup and your setup for your next client, all while the client you currently are working on is receiving the benefit of the photofacial application. The client feels nothing. It is pretty bright. We use tanning goggles to cut down the brightness. And the benefit too of the panel is you can roll it around. You can use it on any body part. It does have floor space issues. So if you're in a very tiny room, it's not always the best solution, whereas the flexible panels can work really well. Another LED source you can use is the mask. I call it the Freddy Krueger mask. And this plugs in. I haven't seen any battery operated ones, but this plugs in. It uses the wavelengths of light that can reduce the inflammation. Clients like this if they need to be engaged in their phone, or if they need to communicate, they can talk through this. So these sometimes have a wraparound headband, so you can use it sitting up. So some of our clients would actually get in the waiting room, and it was a funny congregation of people gathered with all these masks on talking to each other. They enjoyed that because they haven't been able to talk to their colleagues or their friends for a while. So this has been a nice addition. I don't particularly like this personally because I don't like that feeling of having that thing so close on my face for that long. But it really does work. You can get this over the counter. I think Ulta makes them. You can get them online through Amazon and eBay for relatively inexpensive. And they do work. Some of the manufacturers have added some technologies. Some of these have built-in microcurrent points on them, so you get a little buzz while you're getting the LED. Not a bad thing to do if you want to try that, and you can turn that on or off. They're not expensive. You can get into these masks for just a few $100s, and they really do work. And then you just have to worry about sanitizing between clients and wiping them down, which is not a big deal. Just use some Lysol wipes or antibacterial wipes between treatments. So the issue is on LEDs is, do they work? And the science shows that they do. And which one is the best? Well, it depends on your budget. What you want to, what can you afford? And if you can only afford the handheld LEDs off of Amazon, or you might even be able to find them, I think at TJ Maxx or someplace like that. If you want to get those to get them started, it's worthwhile to get it started. And then you'll quickly realize that the handheld ones are pretty boring. And if you move up to the shields, the Freddy Krueger mask, or if you want to go all out and get the LED panels, these are nice because they're hands off. So you can just turn them on and walk away. And they have a little timer on them. You can adjust it. And you can also adjust what wavelengths you're using with this, which you can do with the LED mask. They have a controller. You can see that controller is actually sitting on this tabletop, and you can adjust which colors or wavelengths come out of that LED mask. And so that's what we're going to talk about next, is how do those wavelengths work? What happens with them? What colors do we use? Now, when you look at medical and scientific publications, this is a journal that I like reading. You can get this online. It's called Metaesthetics Magazine. I'll put in a plug for that journal. And they have more medically related aesthetics articles. When you start reading some of the scientific publications and the journal publications, what you'll quickly find is the more medical they are, the bigger the words are that they use. So this author put together this string of words that he calls, and this is an abstract. This is what we see at the front end of the article. It summarizes how LEDs work on the tissue. They put these words together that he calls photobiomodulation. Okay, who talks like this? Scientists do, because they like to sound like they know what they're talking about. So let's look at this word and break it down. Let's look at the word photo. What they're talking about is light. So what happens when you put specific wavelengths of light? Bio, if you look at the root word of biology, which is the study of living tissue, they put light on living tissue. When they put those specific wavelengths of light on living tissue, it causes that tissue to change or alter. And that word for change is modulation. If you're a musician, you know how to modulate, because you're gonna sing or play a song in one key, and then you may want to modulate or change the key and make it go up or down. So modulate means to change. So light on living tissue causes it to change. So let's look at the abstract and let's break that down. So the abstract shows that the cells, which is living tissue, get an energy boost when you put the light directly on the tissue, and the energy exchange has no heat exchange. So there's no heat. In science, the letter A in front of a word means none. So in this study, what they've shown is that there's no heat, but you get energy exchange between light, which this author calls photons, which I'll tell you where that word came from in just a moment, and the living tissue, which is the biology. So you put the light on the tissue, no heat, but you get an energy exchange between the light source and the living tissue. And when that happens, here's the NASA article that showed what happens in this situation. That when this happens, the cells increase their mitosis, which means they replicate faster, and they do what they're supposed to do more efficiently. So that is the summation of this fancy schmancy word that this author put together called photobiomodulation. We put light on living tissue, it caused it to change. What we find in the aesthetic industry is when we use the red and the blue together, it's really a good treatment for acne. And I'll tell you why as we get to that slide. Now, this is a very interesting and complicated article that I came across. It was published over a decade ago, but the science holds true on this. Most of you are not going to read the Journal of Photobiology. It is a really geeky scientific journal that, in this case, if you can even interpret the title of the journal, Clinical Profilometric Histologic Ultrastructural and Biochemical Evaluations, a comparison of 3 different treatment settings. Wow. That's a big scientific title. Let's sum it up. Let's bring this to a level that's a little more understandable. So what these scientists did is they used different wavelengths of light. They used the wavelength that's above red, which is what we call infrared. And the infrared wavelength they used is 830 nanometers. They also used a red wavelength at a very, very specific color, which is 633 nanometers. Then they used both the red and infrared together, and they used it against a control. And the control that they used it against was against multiple wavelengths without any specific one wavelength. So they found when they used red and infrared together, they found a result of decreased wrinkles, increased elasticity, and increased collagen and elastin. Let's look at how that works, because it's pretty amazing when you think about what this light tissue is doing, what this light is doing to the tissue. So if you remember your anatomy of epidermis and dermal tissue, we know that elastin and collagen form the support of the dermal tissue. Collagen and elastin are not in the epidermis, they're in the dermal tissue. When collagen and elastin break down, that breakdown causes wrinkles because it cannot support the epidermis. So we see wrinkles as a result of the breakdown of collagen and elastin. Let's sum that up. When you use red and infrared at exactly these wavelengths, that light is penetrating through the epidermis all the way down to the dermis, and it's causing changes in the dermal tissue, which is going to strengthen and enhance that dermal tissue. So you see a decrease in the wrinkles, which is pretty amazing, because what do they feel? Nothing. It's athermal. And they're using very specific wavelengths of light to create energy exchange all the way down to the dermal tissue. And how long do they need to be under the lights for the client to see a change? A minute and a half. Could they be under there for longer? Oh yeah, they could. So the longer you're under there, the better results you'll get, but you'll get an initial change just within a couple minutes. That's a pretty amazing study when it's explained correctly. It's really hard to get that out of it if you just look at it and say, oh yeah, that's a geeky scientific article. Let's look at how blue light works in the LED industry for estheticians. So if you look at the Roy G. Biv visible light spectrum, the B part of Roy G. Biv is blue, and the wavelength at blue is around 400 nanometers. What they found is that when you use blue light at 400 nanometers, it actually produces oxygen within the tissue it's being exposed to. So when you use that wavelength at the right energy output, it manufactures oxygen in the tissue. What we know about acne breakouts, excuse me, is that many of the acne breakouts can be pointed to with this crazy bacteria that not many people can pronounce the name of, that's in the follicle in our skin. And that bacteria, that if you remember back in school, when you looked at the textbook and your teacher told you it's P. acne bacteria, that P stands for Propionibacterium acne. It is a bacteria that resides in the follicles, and that bacteria does not like oxygen. So it's what we call an anaerobic bacteria. What happens with an acne breakout is you get an inflammatory response from either diet, hormones, stress. Many different things can trigger an acne breakout. When that inflammation begins, it closes the follicle where that bacteria lives. That occlusion of the follicle cuts off the oxygen supply to that bacteria. And if that bacteria is anaerobic, that means it doesn't like oxygen. And that's when that bacteria propagates. So that bacteria starts to produce its byproduct, pus, when it is in an inflammatory state. And when you put the red and infrared lights on there, according to the NASA study, it reduces the inflammation. And if you use the blue light, it increases the oxygen in that place where the bacteria lives. So we actually use red and blue together when we do our skin treatments with the LED. And it tends to work really well when you do that. We use red and blue together on virtually every treatment. We just combine the wavelengths. And most of the devices that are on the market today in those panels or the masks allow you to use red and blue at the same time. If they don't, then you can give them a hit of red and then a hit of blue. But if you're shopping for some of these devices and are in the market for them, make sure you're looking for a device that can produce the red wavelengths as well as the blue wavelengths simultaneously. So that way you can just turn them both on and walk away. Okay, let me share one other LED with you. And I just got one of these devices in. I'm going to show you on the camera on how these work. But this is an LED panel that's in a flexible membrane. And this client is laying on her stomach for this photo op. And these colors of light have a very, very specific wavelength. And they penetrate through the epidermis, through the dermis, all the way to the subcutaneous. The category of these lights, if you look in the literature, is labeled as LLLT, which stands for low level light therapy. Some people call it low level laser therapy, but it's really low level light therapy. And there's several articles about how this works. There's multiple devices on the marketplace. This one is flexible, and when you put it on the skin, you can actually wrap it around the skin. It needs to be very, very close to the skin. In this case, it's touching the skin. The mechanism of action of this low-level light therapy is to penetrate all the way down to the fat cells. And when that wavelength at that energy hits the fat cells, the influence on the fat cells is to open them and dilate the cell membrane temporarily. So those fat cells, while they're under the influence of these lights, are causing the cell membrane to become more porous, and the content of the fat cells can then leak out, and they leak into your lymphatic drainage system. So this body treatment can be done while you're doing a facial treatment, and it is athermal. You don't feel anything, and the fat cells will slowly leak some of their content out, and then you eventually excrete it by peeing it out after you continue to hydrate and increase your lymphatic drainage flow. Your lymphatic drainage flow, for those of you who are doing lymphatic drainage treatments, can be accelerated by massage, exercise, and if you have access to it, they also make a vibrating platform And some of the fitness centers have these where you stand on the platform and you jiggle, and that jiggling increases the lymphatic drainage flow. Now, let me show off what I just got a couple of days ago, and I'll hold it up to the camera so you can see it. And this is actually, I'm going to move away from the camera a little bit. So this is a belt that you can put on your body against the skin, and this belt has a bed of LED lights that is flexible and allows you to put these lights directly against the tissue. Now, this one has two wavelengths in it. It has the red at 635 nanometers, and it also has an infrared wavelength, which also accentuates the fat cell membrane dilation. So with the infrared, you get a little bit of heat generation, not a lot, just a little bit. Now this one is kind of interesting because as opposed to the picture in the PowerPoint I've got, this one has a battery pack on it. So this one you can wear under your clothes, and you can wear this for as long as you want to until the battery runs out. So this is one that you can use, and you can use it pretty much all day long. I've used these all day long before, and they really do work. So the membrane on this you can wipe off. So if you're using this on multiple clients, between clients, you just do your anti-bac wipe on the surface of this, and it holds up pretty well. So this is a new device I just got in, and we use it in our training classes for medical aesthetics training on how to do body treatments along with facial treatments. So this is a form of LED. Typically, you're not going to feel anything with this. This manufacturer built in some infrared into it, so you get a little bit of warmth as well. This treatment can be accentuated by using some components of body wraps. Some of you may be doing body wraps, and you know how that works if you're experienced with it. You can use a topical treatment. Many times it's seaweed extract, and that topical treatment put onto the skin does what's called a chelation effect, and that chelation actually pulls water out of the tissue, and that's where you get the results of the quick results of the body wrap. Is that seaweed extract extracts water from the tissue that it's applied to. So you can do a body wrap application of seaweed extract and then put this LED light right on the tissue, and that 1-2 combination works really well, especially if you follow it up with hydration. So you got to drink some water, and you also got to do some type of lymphatic drainage flow. The vibrating platforms are pretty easy to get. You can actually get them at local sporting goods stores, and the more you spend on these vibrating platforms that you stand on, the longer they last. You can get them for a couple of $100s at places like Dick's Sporting Goods. The low-end ones tend to break down relatively quickly. So my recommendation, having used these for a while, is if you're going to get into body treatments and you're going to get a vibrating platform, spend a few extra bucks and get a higher end platform. They tend to work pretty well. Okay, that's LEDs. I'm going to spend the next 30 minutes talking about lasers and light tissue interaction with what we call IPLs and how we get into hair removal. So I'm going to go about 30 minutes on this, and then we'll pause, and then I'm going to have another video for Miss Ashley to queue up on chemical peels. So laser physics uses a wavelength of light that is emitted from a crystal. And laser in the cosmetic industry uses a crystal like a ruby or a garnet, and that crystal is excited, and when that crystal gets excited, it emits radiation. So what we do in the laser world is we take this crystal and we stimulate it. And that stimulation is done with some type of device that excites the crystal. And that device is what we call a laser device. And when we excite the crystal, what comes out of it is a color of light that we measure in wavelengths. The guy who thought this up at the get-go was Einstein. And I don't think at 26 years of age, getting his foot into the field of physics, I don't think he was thinking about doing hair removal on someone's underarms or legs so they wouldn't have to shave. But what he came up with is this idea, and it was an idea. He had no way of really verifying that atoms existed, but he put together this protocol that said, if atoms existed, this is what they would do. So over 100 years ago, he came up with these theories that nobody could prove. But today, over 100 years later, scientists are looking back and saying, oh my gosh, Einstein was right after all. So he came up with this idea that atoms existed, and when you excite them, they release a packet of energy that Einstein labeled as a photon. And that photon comes from a crystal, in this case, an atom inside of a crystal. So if you look at a ruby crystal, what we see is the crystal gets excited by plugging it in, pulling the trigger. What comes off of that excited crystal is a burst of light that Einstein called a photon. And that photon is emitted and is attracted to a target. What does this have to do with hair removal? It has a lot to do with hair removal and vascular and pigmented lesions, because the color of light that's coming out of that crystal is attracted to a target, and the target in hair removal is melanin in the hair follicle. So it finds the melanin absorbs the light, converts it to heat, and burns it up. What we're talking about is a color of light. And each crystal has its own color of light, which is measured in wavelengths that we call nanometers. We can also turn the energy of that light source up or down. We measure energy in joules. And we want to use less energy when we work on darker skin, because it turns out that the light is attracted to pigment, and in darker skin, you could burn up skin as well as hair if you don't know what you're doing. So the way that laser physics works is you use a wavelength at a specific energy, and when you pull a trigger, it flashes for a short amount of time, literally a fraction of a second, and that's going to be attracted to a target, and that target is going to absorb the light, convert it to heat, and destroy that tissue. So our goal is to find the target that we want to destroy. In the case of hair removal, it's hair, and hair that has pigment in it. So hair removal works on hair that has color in it. So it does not work on hair that doesn't have color in it. So if you wanted to do laser hair removal, it doesn't work on blonde hair. It doesn't work on vellus hair. It doesn't work on darker skin, because it can't tell a difference between what's the melanin in the skin and what's the melanin in the hair. And it also doesn't work on red hair, because the melanin in red hair is a different kind of melanin. It's what we call eumelanin. So we want to create heat exchange in the melanin in the hair, but we don't want to create heat exchange in the melanin in the skin. And unfortunately, most of the lasers don't know the difference between our target and our surrounding tissue. So we have to be really careful about how much energy we use. We know that light can penetrate through the tissue, and the wavelengths or colors of light we use are attracted to specific tissues, like melanin or hemoglobin or water. Once it finds that tissue absorbs it, converts it to heat. We want to use the right wavelength of light in the right tissue to destroy the target, so we have to control light-tissue interaction. The way lasers work is we have a crystal inside of the device, and when that crystal is turned on and fired up, it puts out a wavelength specific to that crystal. There's another type of device that's popular in the marketplace that doesn't use a crystal, but that also destroys tissue. And it's called a broad spectrum light, commonly called an intense pulsed light or a broadband light. They're all called the same thing. And they put out Roy G. Biv when you pull a trigger on it because it's a light bulb instead of a crystal. So the difference between an IPL and a laser is the laser puts out one wavelength and an IPL puts out Roy G. Biv. So a laser has one mono color chromatic, and when it is fired, that crystal puts out one wavelength and it finds the target. That target absorbs it and burns it up. In a broad spectrum light, you've got a light bulb inside of the handpiece, and when you pull the trigger, what comes out of that light bulb is Roy G. Biv, and that is then put on the tissue, and it finds those targets within Roy G. Biv to burn up. So a broad spectrum light can do many, many things. A laser does one thing because it has one wavelength. So over the next couple minutes, what I'm going to do is summarize how the light destroys the tissue in laser and broad spectrum light. And we'll talk specifically about hair removal because it is one of the most popular treatments on the market. We'll talk about how that works and why it works. And to review, we know that light is measured by its wavelength, and the wavelength is measured in a billionth of a meter called a nanometer. And these wavelengths are very, very specific, down to the billionth of a meter, and they're that way so that they work accurately. So here's a slide of Roy G. Biv again, and this is electromagnetic energy. And here's AM radio, television, radar. Here's infrared, and here's Roy G. Biv. And below violet is ultraviolet. What we see up at the top are all of these devices are lasers that we use in the cosmetic laser industry. One of the very first laser hair removal devices that we used in this industry was from a ruby crystal. And the ruby crystal put out a wavelength of exactly 694 nanometers. So when you have a ruby laser, you would fire it, you put it on the tissue wherever they did not want to grow hair, and it would put out a color of light at 694 nanometers exactly, and it would find melanin, and when it found the melanin, it would absorb the light, convert it to heat, and blow up the hair follicle. Now, ruby was one of our first laser hair removal devices. Nobody uses a ruby laser anymore. It's old school. They don't make them anymore. You can't sell them. If you have one, there's nothing you can do with it. Because there's another laser that has stepped up to the plate that physicists came up with, and it has a wavelength of 755 nanometers, and it's made from a different crystal. It's called an alexandrite crystal. And that alexandrite crystal puts out a wavelength of 755 nanometers, and that works better than the ruby. So the ruby is a little bit outdated. There's another laser in the industry that is outdating the alexandrite, and it's made from a synthetic crystal called a diode crystal, and the wavelength is 810 nanometers, and that's the gold standard for laser hair removal devices. Now, if you're using a laser for hair removal and you're using the best and fastest and the most advanced one, you're using an 810 diode laser. Some of the other crystals that are out there that we use in the laser industry is here's a garnet crystal. That G stands for garnet. And this garnet is coated with something that these physicists came up with. And you don't have to know what that is. It's crazy what they came up with, but they coated a garnet with this substance. And when that garnet is excited and you pull a trigger on it, what comes out of there is a wavelength of 1064 nanometers. So that garnet crystal is what we call a 1064 YAG, And that wavelength at 1064 nanometers is attracted to hemoglobin. We use that frequently for vascular blemishes, for telangiectasias, for cherry angiomas, etc. Here's two others, and then I'll get off of this page and get to some more practical stuff. Here's another garnet that physicists developed this and coated it with something else, and that is what we call an erbium YAG laser, and that's attracted to water. So if you use an erbium YAG, the wavelength is 2,940 nanometers, and that wavelength finds water in the epidermis and heats up the water and cuts the skin. So you can use an erbium YAG to resurface the skin, and there's another laser that's attracted to water called a CO2 laser. Both the erbium YAG and the CO2 are attracted to water, and when they find water, it heats water up so hot that it cuts the skin. We used to use a CO2 to surgically cut off epidermis for those clients who had disfiguring acne scars, chickenpox scars, etc. So nowadays, nobody does that anymore because they found a way to break up an erbium and a CO2 into fractions of laser beams in one handpiece. So you can fractionate those laser beams at an erbium or a CO2 and punch little tiny holes in the tissue. And we call that a fractional laser. Sometimes people call it a Fraxel laser. That Fraxel laser is actually a trademark for a company. And that those little tiny laser beams cut holes in the tissue, and then they leave healthy tissue around them to heal up. What we know about light when we put it on the tissue is it can bounce off, it can spread around. What we want light to do is from the source, when we pull a trigger, we want it to find its target and absorb it, convert that into light into heat. Enough heat is generated to destroy the target. I'm not going to spend too much time on this because it's a little bit confusing unless you spend time on it, and I'm going to gloss over it. This basically says the longer the wavelength, the deeper it penetrates. So here's Roy, here's G, here's Biv. And so Roy is deeper than Biv. So hair is deeper than acne. We use the color of red when we do hair removal, and we use blue when we're doing acne treatments because it's more superficial. These are different laser devices, and these laser devices are, each one of these is an individual laser that we use. And if you look at the anatomy, there's epidermis, there's dermis, and there's subcutaneous. So the way this works is that these laser beams come from one crystal, and what they do, here's the ruby hair removal at 694 nanometers. You put that on the skin, it goes through the epidermis down to the dermis where that actively growing hair follicle resides. When it finds the melanin in that hair follicle, that melanin absorbs the light, converts it to heat, and burns up that hair follicle. But it only burns it up if it's actively growing. So that hair follicle has to be in the anagen growth phase. That's why hair removal takes multiple treatments. It's not because they're gradually increasing the treatment, it's because they don't know which hairs are in the anagen growth phase in the area that you don't want to shave. So the reason you do multiple sessions is because you have to hit the hair in the anagen growth phase, and there's no way to predict which ones are and which ones aren't. So you do the treatment every 4 weeks until you get as many of them gone as you want and can afford. Here's the newest generation of a laser hair removal. It's an 810 nanometer diode, which is a little bit longer than the ruby and the alexandrite. So it penetrates just a little bit deeper, and it tends to be more effective. Here's the 1064 YAG. It's attracted to hemoglobin, and you can see it goes all the way down to that sub-Q layer to find the hemoglobin. Here's the two cutting lasers that we now use with fractional treatments. And the erbium penetrates at the epidermal layer, and the CO2 penetrates through the epidermis down to the dermis. So you can do a fractional erbium and get really good results without a lot of downtime. If you do a fractional CO2, it ends up hurting a lot more. You get a little more swelling, some scabbing, and you can do these treatments about every 4 to 6 to 8 weeks. Doctors like to do these. They don't like to delegate them out to their estheticians because the risk of trauma is a lot higher when you do a CO2 fractional. Okay, I've got 2 more slides, and then I'm going to stop and we'll be finished with the first section. So the way we do this is we take light, which is the photo part, and we apply it to a target. So the client comes to us and says, I want to get rid of what? Well, I want to get rid of this rosacea. I want to get rid of this hair. I want to get rid of this pigmentation. I want to get rid of these wrinkles. So the target, fancy name for that, is called chromophore. The target is going to be hemoglobin, which is the red color of blood, melanin, which is the pigment in our hair and our skin, or water, which we find in the epidermis and dermis. So we want to find a target, and then we match up the target with the color of light, which we call a wavelength, which we measure in nanometers. So we put the right wavelength to find the right target. Once we fire the device, then that converts that light into heat, which is what we call thermo. And if you do this correctly and you use the right amount of energy, which is measured in joules, we're going to take that light and transform it to heat, and enough heat is generated to do what we call cell lysis, which is called cell destruction by the high temperature. Okay, so what we're going to do is fire the laser. The laser gets passed through the skin, trying not to destroy the target around it, but to find the target and burn it up. Okay, that's what I'm going to do at this point. I'm going to stop and we'll take a break, and then Miss Ashley will start you up in just a little bit.